Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Codex. Today I'm going to be discussing the new primed mod from Baro, and that is primed dual rounds for our art guns. I think a lot of people misunderstand exactly how much of an upgrade this mod is. Largely because I know a lot of people just don't care about art guns because it's not used in a lot of content, maybe they don't do Profit Taker, things like that. The thing is, if you do the content in the game where it's useful, this is a huge upgrade. For example, this is a huge damage bump for doing Profit Taker runs, which is essentially the best credit farm in the game, and it's also really good for getting toroids for Little Duck. Another example that I would use is Elite Deep Arc and Media on the weeks where you don't have the gear embargo, which means you're able to use your gear, which includes things like crewmates and specters, which I've gone over before, which is super useful. Another thing that allows you to use is calling down your art gun in EDA. And there is some situations in which if you have really horrible weapon choices that week, and you didn't take like a free replacement, for example, then your art gun might be better than some of your actual gun choices. Like if you got a good frame, for example, like say you got Revenant, something you could easily survive on, and then all of your guns are terrible, and for one reason or another, you don't feel like getting slightly less research points to take a gun of your choice. You can call down an art gun, and maybe that performs a lot better, especially if you have buffs on you like Roar, Nourish, etc. So that's another example of which you'd want to use that. Now let's talk about the actual math of going from 60% multi-shot to 110%. This is such a massive upgrade to art gun's damage, it is insane. So first we'll talk about the actual damage increase. If I go from dual rounds to prime dual rounds, you can see on my Moslon build, for example, I go from 3306 to 4339 for the main fire damage. And then from about 82,000 to 108,000 damage on the radial explosion attack. That is single-handedly a 31%, slightly a little bit more than that, but that's single-handedly a 31% DPS bump. Getting a instantaneous 1.3x multiplier on your previous damage is already massive. That's, of course, a huge damage increase. Most mod replacements don't, do that. So the other thing about prime dual rounds is not just is it a massive average damage increase, but it also dramatically improves the consistent performance of your art gun. So let's go back and look at regular dual rounds. It only gives you 60% multi-shot. 60% multi-shot still means that 40% of the time you are not firing a second round. So you only did double damage 60% of the time, and you did effectively half of what your maximum damage was 40% of the time. So still almost half of the time, you did essentially half damage. So going from that extreme inconsistency to 110% multi-shot, which means that you always fire 2 shots, and now even have a 10% chance at a third shot, and whenever that goes off, you'll do dramatically more damage than art guns ever did before. That is a huge damage increase. For me, the consistency is the major thing over the technical damage increase. Now, of course, consistency is a damage increase, but, like, for example, even if this was just 100% multi-shot rather than 110, this would still be much, much better than dual rounds just because of guaranteeing that second shot is the most important thing about this mod being primed. Now, some people will mention the radiation mod, Containment Breach. This is a very good mod. It gives you 60% radiation, 30% multi-shot. So perhaps the comparison isn't between prime dual rounds and regular dual rounds, but regular dual rounds and in Containment Breach versus prime dual rounds, because I, of course, at least previously, would highly recommend using this, because if you used Containment Breach and regular dual rounds, then that brought your multi-shot from 60 up to 90%, and of course that's much more consistent, along with the extra radiation damage being just a nice damage bonus, especially if the enemy happens to be weak to radiation, like the Profit Taker was, for example. In fact, that's part of the PSA of this video, which we'll talk about in a moment here. So even with Containment Breach and regular dual rounds, that's still only 90% multi-shot, which means that you still 10% of the time weren't hitting that second shot. So again, another useful thing about prime dual rounds is that if you want, you can keep running Containment Breach, and in fact, I probably would recommend that on a lot of builds, just because there's not that many art gun mods, so the competition for what is the best mod slot is a bit lower. So getting 60% radiation damage and 30% multi-shot, taking you from 110 to 140, for example, and extra radiation, is probably still best in slot, as in like an 8th mod slot, for example, on a lot of builds. But if it's not, The really nice thing about Prime Dual Rounds is that it replaces what I would call previously the mandatory requirement to run that radiation mod, Containment Breach. Like, this was mandatory in my opinion. Going from 60 to 90% multi-shot, you had no choice but to run that, because increasing, again, the consistency of that second shot is pretty much the largest damage increase that you could put on arc guns. Now you don't have to run this. You can, and you can hit 3 shots a good amount of the time, but you don't have to anymore, is what I'm saying. So that's super good. Like, for example, here's my Chroma Profit Taker build. I'm not using Robito-lined barrel on this, because, again, Chroma gives base damage, so you don't need that. So in the case of Profit Taker, for example, this alone is, a huge damage increase, especially multiplying off the massive thousands of percents of base damage that Chroma can give. So that'll be fun to try out. I haven't actually done that yet. And I am still using Containment Breach here, as you can see. Partially because I just haven't rethought about the build since she's no longer weak to radiation. And in fact, let's talk about that.
Excellent.
Because part of this video,
please return.
I wanted to do a PSA about Profit Taker. For anybody who runs Profit Taker, keep in mind that we did just have a rework to damage where all damage resistances that enemies have is now faction-based. So if you look at the codex, it looks like that also includes the Profit Taker. If you recall previously, due to the fact that the Profit Taker had alloy armor, she would have an alloy armor weakness, which is radiation damage. Now, just because she's Corpus, and the Corpus faction weakness is magnetic and puncture, that also makes her weak to magnetic and puncture. So essentially that means that you want to swap all of your Profit Taker arc gun loadouts to magnetic damage instead of the radiation that it used to be. So I just wanted to throw that in here in this video to basically announce that to anybody who didn't realize that or think about the fact that that faction rework may have changed that. But yeah, anyways, definitely recommend going to Baro tier and grabbing that mod. In fact, just to wrap the video off, I'll go ahead and jump over to Baro, and we'll super quickly talk about some of the other things he has. So I'll see you there in a moment. Figured I might as well do this since I didn't technically release a Baro video this time. And to be honest, I don't know if I'll do those moving forward, just because so many people do them. I feel like me adding on to that probably doesn't really add a whole lot of value to you guys. So unless you like my particular style of input on that, I'm thinking about whether or not I'm going to be doing those bi-weekly Baro videos. But anyways, here we are at Baro. Here again is the mod. Definitely get Prime Dual Rounds. He actually brought multiple very good mods. Prime Dual Rounds, absolutely essential for arc guns. Primed Reach, absolutely essential for a lot of melee builds. Prime Firestorm, absolutely essential for a huge amount of rifle AoE builds. Increasing your blast radius is often the best in slot mod that you can use for those. Combo Killer is an interesting one. If you want to do an interesting kind of combo build between your melee and your secondary, this can be fun to use, so you can think about that. He also brought some weapons. So the Quantum Vandal and the Prisma Veritex. The Prisma Veritex is actually a fairly decent arc melee, although you basically never melee in your arc loadouts. And he also brought the Prisma Lens. So definitely the Prisma Lens and the Quantum Vandal. I mean, I would get all three of them just because they're at the very least mastery fodder, but the Prisma Lens and the Quantum Vandal, actually decent weapons. A lot of cosmetics, of course. It's up to you. I've mentioned the Fate Path Ephemera before. It's nice that this is essentially free, so if you don't have an Ephemera, if you're a newer player, this costs almost nothing. So you can have at least this Ephemera, if nothing else. Some cool cosmetics, like the Katir pedestal and whatnot. The Dual Sword Lemnes skin. Definitely get the color palette. Color palettes that don't cost platinum are always appreciated, especially when they actually have nice colors, like this Katir palette has. You got Kavat armor, so on, so on. It's, aside from the mods and the weapons, it's mostly up to taste, because again, that's how cosmetics work. But definitely get Prime Dual Rounds, definitely get Prime Reach, and definitely get Prime Firestorm. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and wrap up the video, and I will see you guys in the next one.